Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary concepts and more to help you become a literary expert. So if you're new to my channel and that sounds exactly like what you need, then make sure that you hit the subscribe button below. So in today's video, we are going to be looking at literature from a slightly different angle, and we're going to be using art as the medium for understanding Shakespeare's play, Macbeth. So if you've been following my channel for a while, you know that our focus here has always been overwhelmingly on the words and the language aspect of literature. But I've recently taken up a sudden interest in painting, which has really inspired me to look deeper and closer at words through images. Now, indeed, one of the main stylistic techniques in literature is imagery. But it seems like no matter how vivid a writer's descriptions are, there's always a point at which those 26 alphabets and their permutations in the English language bump up against their representational limits, especially when it comes to conveying emotional intensity or states of ambivalence, chaos, and contradictions. But of course, because our focus here is always going to be on the literary text with art as a supplementary tool for interpretation, I wouldn't stress too much about looking at these lit-inspired paintings that I'm about to show you like a professional art critic. In fact, oftentimes even just a visceral, immediate, emotional response to a painting about a literary work could suffice for us to develop interesting ideas and to engage with the writing in a completely different way. Now that said, three aspects should always stand out for commentary, which are symbolism of the subject matter, the color scheme, and the use of perspective and proportions in the composition. For instance, by observing the artist's use of light and shadow, large or small scaling, center or marginal positioning, asymmetrical, symmetrical, or radial balance in the canvas, we can already extrapolate really interesting insights into how the artist's impression could shape our perception on the literary subject matter. So with that, let's dive straight into the analysis. It's going to be a fun one. Now, one of the most instructive things to pay attention to when we're considering an artist's impression of a literary scene is their point of focus. Do they choose to focus on the character's facial expression, or have they zoomed out to look at the panoramic landscape instead? Often this decision will be influenced partly by the art school or movement that the painter is affiliated with. So for example, a neoclassical painter might be inclined to focus on the human form and portrait, and so make the human characters the focal point of their canvas. Whereas a romanticist painter is likely to capture the vastness of the natural environment, with humans only featured as part of a larger scenery. Now we see this distinction in some of the most famous paintings about Macbeth, with Henry Fuseli and Theodore Chassériau presenting Macbeth and the witches in vivid human form and animated expressions, and on the other hand, a realist painter like Clarkson, Frederick, Stanfield, or the late baroque painter like Francesco Zuccarelli portraying the same Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth, encountering the witches on the heath, from a strikingly opposite perspective of looking at the broader natural environs and reducing the characters to just mere specks in their composition. Fuseli had a penchant for the supernatural, which often lent his impressions of characters an eerie and haunting touch. This is reflected in his paintings Macbeth and Banquo Meet the Three Witches on a Heath, and his portrayal of the Three Weird Sisters, circa 1783. Wherein the witches are given grotesque faces with devilish eyes, eagled noses, and ghostly hoods. Their long, creepy fingers pointing towards the same uniform direction, and there almost seems to be rays emanating from their fingers in the bigger painting containing Macbeth and Banquo, as you see. While Macbeth and Banquo are only shown partially from their side angle from the back. Now, looking at these images, we get the sense that the supernatural agents, the witches, are the main stars of the show, commanding the strongest hold over our dramatic and artistic imaginations. The compositional balance between Macbeth and Banquo vis-a-vis the witches is more even in Chasseriau's 1855 painting. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. Now, given Chasseriau's orientalist style, the palette, as you can see, is much more saturated, with more attention given to the intricacies of the military sartorial details, as we see in the elaborate helmet, harness chains, bright coral hues, and crimson robes on Macbeth. The cinematic flourish and action of the horses and the soldiers give Macbeth and Banquo a heroic nobility that's somewhat missing from Fuseli's representation. But the witches are no less haunting in Chasseriau's canvas. Instead of a troupe of monotonous ghost-like figures, however, Chasseriau's witches appear as old hags with muscular arms flailing in the air, distinguished by their burgundy, orange, and olive robes. This sharp, vivid emphasis on the clothing of the characters echo Banquo's sentiment that these creatures are so wild in their attire, but not quite the part where Shakespeare writes they are supposed to be so withered that look not like the inhabitants on the earth. On the contrary, Chasseriau's witches look strong, sinewy, and that makes them look less like women than men, which perhaps suggests that from the artist's perspective here, the strength of the witches is just as, if not even more masculine than that of Macbeth and Banquo, and not at all those withered or skinny creatures as Shakespeare's original lines describe. On the other hand, we have the British realist landscape painter Clarkson Frederick Stanfield representing his impression of the same scene in a starkly different light. Had the title of his 1850 painting not said Macbeth and the Witches, I frankly wouldn't have known that it was related to the play at all. As you can see here, the characters are almost indiscernible in the canvas, as the focus is overwhelmingly placed on the massive rocky heath in the distance, with a zoomed-out perspective that draws the viewer's eyes to the dramatic sky and the numinous mountains, very much reflecting the romantic sublime concept. The foggy, blurry mystique in the distance seems to reflect the spirit in Macbeth's lines, "into the air," and what seemed corporal melted as breath into the wind. Now, we almost have to squint and look again to notice that there's the tiny Macbeth and Banquo in the bottom right of the canvas, looking across at the witches on the other side of the boulder, who are shown in an equally small scale. This seems like a quintessentially romantic take on the scene, with its clear message of the sublime coming through in nature's vast, imposing presence, engulfing those tiny powerless men who are, in the grand composition of the universe, no more than a mere speck against the backdrop of the great mountains, skies, and seas. Going back to our interpretation of the play itself, Stanfield's Romanticist impression offers an interesting chance for us to reconsider Shakespeare's play's sources of power. Instead of the supernatural and the witches being the most powerful agents in Shakespeare's play, which something like Fuseli's representation might have us think, there is room here to think about the broader environs and the atmosphere as also possessing some kind of unfathomable force affecting Macbeth and Banquo's actions, despite this not being explicitly conveyed in the original play. Now, another example of note is Francesco Zuccarelli's 1767 painting, also, of course, of this very same moment in the play. Zuccarelli was a late Italian Baroque painter, and his artwork conveys a whimsical touch characteristic of the sort of Baroque rococo style, which is reflected, for instance, in the humorous impression of the witches appearing as if they're magicians, waving what seems like wands towards Macbeth and Banquo, who don't really look anything like those macho Scottish soldiers, unseeming enemies from the knave to the chaps, but more like these leisurely, aristocratic men donned in lush, flamboyant robes, trying to strike up a conversation with three maidens, while a group of peasants labour away in the background, a very unlikely reinterpretation of Shakespeare's original scenario. It's an unlikely but unique adaptation of the scene, and once again, though, this provides kind of food for thought as to whether the surroundings, the trees, wind, natural scenery, etc., could also possess some measure of influence over Macbeth's thoughts and actions, rather than simply resorting to the more obvious reading of the witch's prophecy or his own psyche or tragic flaw as being the primary drivers of his diabolical behaviour. Now, another famous scene from the play that's inspired many artists is Act 4, Scene 1, otherwise known as the banquet scene, where Banquo's ghost appears to terrorise Macbeth. Chasseriau, whose paintings we've looked at earlier, also produced an impression of this moment, which is a piece of work I find especially memorable and striking. In the center of the canvas, as you see, sits a ghost like Banquo, who's shrouded in a mass of cloudy white, staring straight into the terrified eyes of Macbeth while all the other banquet attendees look on. This evokes both the situation and sentiment in Macbeth's exclamation of, "Thy blood is cold, thou hast no speculation in those eyes which thou dost glare with." Again, there's the orientalist vibe in the use of bold, saturated color juxtapositions of emerald, red, orange, and gold, which conveys a warm and carnivalesque feeling that's oddly counterposed by the splash of cold, ghostly white from Banquo positioned in the middle. But what I find most intriguing is that in Chasseriau's canvas, Lady Macbeth also appears to be looking at Banquo's ghost and thus seemingly registering its presence alongside her husband. Whereas, of course, in Shakespeare's original, she doesn't see the ghost at all. Interestingly, the Irish painter Daniel Maclise also made Lady Macbeth a point of emphasis in his impression of the banquet scene. As we see from his mural, the light is cast sharply on the queen, who holds her left arm out and up in an authoritative stature as she tries to contain the most admired disorder her distraught husband has stirred up. And in Maclise's painting, Macbeth almost seems to fade into the background with the rest of the many banquet attendees, sharing the same muted beige tone with the masses and not the bright highlight of his much more composed and powerful wife. So from viewing both Chasseriau and Maclise's impressions of this banquet scene, perhaps we'll gain an even stronger sense that Macbeth, despite having gained the throne and kingship, is really the least powerful character at this point in the play, with Banquo's apparition and Lady Macbeth being given the artistic limelight as they are the ones to come to the forefront in the canvases. Finally, and just to share a fun wildcard to make a point about how art can radically reinterpret literature and get us thinking about lit in completely different ways, take a look at this painting. Now, this is the British Baroque painter John Westbrook Chandler's Four Children Acting Macbeth and the Witches. But you'd probably be none the wiser that this cute, innocent painting has anything to do with Shakespeare's unlucky play if you didn't know that this was the title. Now, this also has that light whimsicality one often finds in rococo art. But when applied to such a dark, gloomy play like Macbeth, the unlikely juxtaposition invites us to think about how artistic and visual representation can often expand and sometimes even challenge the possibilities of our interpretation and reinterpretation of any play or literary work. So, if you ever feel stuck on analysing a literary work and find yourself uninspired by the same old interpretation out there about a character or a theme, perhaps a good idea is to turn to art, painting, or sculptures to refresh the way we look at a text. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope this has inspired you to look at literature from a completely different angle and to find ideas from art that you can use to re-engage with language and words in a fresh and new way. It's funny because I've always had a sort of dilettante's interest in art, painting, and design, and was always aware of the intersections between art and lit. But for the longest time, I never really thought of marrying the two domains for my own analysis work, when there's obviously so much to explore when we bring these complementary realms together. So let me know if you'd like to see more of these art and lit crossover videos in the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on any paintings or artwork you've come across that's related to your reading and studies. So for your next video, I recommend that you check out my Macbeth stage performance analysis, which is actually based on my review of the London Suffolk adaptation of the play that I saw back in March 2023. As an example of looking at a written text from another medium, not art, but theatre, which would make much more intuitive sense, of course, given that Shakespeare had intended for his plays to be performed rather than read. And you can check that out right here. Don't forget, of course, to check out my extensive Macbeth playlist if you are studying the play, link in the description box below. So hit that thumbs up button if you found this video helpful in any way, so that YouTube can share it with more passionate lit learners like yourself from all around the world, and to encourage me to keep on making these videos for you. Please subscribe if you haven't already and hit that bell notification so you don't miss out on any of my weekly study videos going forward. You can also consider joining my membership program for exclusive video requests and essay review perks. Check that out in the description box below. And as always, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!